Follow along, Catholic pilgrims, as we follow French doctor of the Church, St. Francis de Sales, through his book, Introduction to the Devout Life. Tune in as we read through this practical guide for living out the Catholic faith well. Welcome back, Catholic pilgrims. I'm so glad to have you with me. If you are a devout Catholic, you know that we are to be striving for holiness. Sainthood is the goal for love of God. You also know that as a devout Catholic, we all fall short sometimes. And while I'm not one to listen to excuses or give an easy pass, it is important that we be gentle with ourselves as we travel down the road to sainthood. Not gentle as in we excuse away our faults and failings, but gentle in that we don't beat ourselves up and allow that to turn us into bitter, crass human beings. St. Francis is going to talk to us today about being gentle towards ourselves, so let's open our books to chapter 9 of the third part and begin. Chapter 9, Gentleness Towards Ourselves. One of the forms in which we should practice gentleness regards ourselves, in never growing irritable with ourselves on our imperfections. For although in reason we must be vexed and angry with ourselves when we commit faults, yet we ought to guard against a bitter, fretful displeasure or spiteful anger with ourselves. Some make a great mistake in being angry because they have been angry, hurt because they have been hurt, and vexed because they have been vexed. Thus, whilst they fancy that they are ridding their breast of anger and that their second passion remedies the first, in truth, they are preparing the way for fresh anger on the first occasion. Besides this, all this indignation and vexation and irritation with ourselves tends to foster pride and springs entirely from self-love, which is displeased at finding that we are not perfect. We should endeavor then to look upon our faults with a calm, collected, firm displeasure. A judge who passes sentence thoughtfully and calmly punishes vice more effectually than if he is impetuous and hasty. For in the latter case, he does not punish so much according to the crime committed as according to his own feeling. And so we correct ourselves more effectually by a quiet, persevering repentance than by an irritated, hasty, passionate repentance. For such as these are not according to the magnitude of our faults, but according to our impulse. For instance, a man who especially aims at purity will be overwhelmed with angry self-reproach for some slight offense against it, whilst he will only laugh at some grievous slander of which he has been guilty. On the contrary, one who especially abhors slander will torment himself in consequence of some slight murmuring, whilst he passed unnoticed a gross act of impurity. And so with other sins. And all this is the consequence of judging conscience by passion instead of by reason. Believe me, that, as the remonstrances of a father will have much greater effect upon his child if they are offered kindly and gently than if they are hot and angry. So when we have erred, if we reprove our heart gently and calmly, rather pitying than reproaching it, and encouraging it to amendment, its repentance will be much deeper and sounder than if we are angry, stormy, and irritable. For instance, if I particularly desired not to yield to the sin of vanity, and nevertheless I fell grievously into it, I would not begin to say to my heart, "Art thou not wretched and abominable to be carried away by vanity after so many good resolutions? Well mayest thou die of shame, and not presume to lift up thine eyes, blind, insolent, faithless traitor to thy God," or so forth. I would rather seek to correct it by reasoning and compassion thus: "My poor heart, here we are fallen into the snare from which we had so often resolved to escape. Come, let us rise up once more and forsake it forever. Let us call for God's mercy and put our trust in it, for it will assist us in standing firmer for the future, so we will return to the path of humility. Let us not be discouraged, but be well on our guard from this time. God will help us and guide us." And by such reproof, I would establish a firmly rooted resolution not to fall again into the same fault, taking such steps as seem advisable and as my director may point out, to prevent it. If anyone does not find that he can sufficiently touch his heart by this gentle correction, he can make use of a harsher, sharper reprehension in order to bring it to utter confusion. But after using severity and reproach, he still should conclude his anger and indignation with a calm, holy confidence in God, imitating that great penitent who, when his soul was prostrate in affliction, consoled it, saying, "Why art thou sad, O my soul? And why dost thou disquiet me? Hope in God, for I will still give praise to him, the salvation of my countenance and my God." Therefore, when your heart has fallen, raise it gently, humbling yourself greatly before God and acknowledging your fault, but without marveling at your fall, since it is no marvel that infirmity should be infirm, weakness weak, and frailty frail. But nevertheless heartily detest the offense of which you have been guilty in God's sight, and with hearty courage and confidence in his mercy, begin once more to seek that virtue from which you have fallen away. I grew up with a bodybuilding dad, as I think I've mentioned before. He still bodybuilds to this day, just doesn't do competitions. My siblings and I watched our dad work out nearly every day of our life. We watched him be disciplined with his diet, and we watched him practice to perfect his bodybuilding routine for competitions. And the great thing for us kids was that he never kept this part of his life separated from us. We went to the gym with him, he ate meals with us, he did athletic things with us, and while we weren't allowed at the competitions, he always showed us the video later so that we could see how his hard work had paid off. With all this discipline, my dad also knew how to be gentle on himself at times too. He never used steroids, ever. He always wanted to get big naturally. And when not in peak training season, he enjoyed desserts, especially the chocolate chip cookies I would frequently make. He knew that he couldn't be too severe, or he would lose the love of bodybuilding, and his favorite hobby would become a burden to him. Consequently, all three of his kids grew up to adopt many of his disciplined habits. My brother even went on to be a personal trainer. My brother, when he was young, he was just the lankiest beanpole that you can imagine, but today he is very toned and a very muscular man. One of the biggest complaints that my brother has with training people is that they want to go so strict, so severe, that they create an unsustainable situation for themselves. If they eat something that's maybe not the most healthy thing in the world, they chastise themselves, and then they just give up, saying that they're worthless and can't do this whole get in shape thing. He tries to encourage them to look at their quote-unquote cheat day as more of a treat day instead, and learn to work their way to more and more discipline, not try to go from 0 to 100 in a matter of days. And this brings me to what we read today. We know that we shouldn't sin. It's not the same as, eating a piece of cake when you're trying to work out. And we should do everything in our power and with the help of God to not sin. But the reality is that we will. We may not commit mortal sins if we are on our game, but venial sins, yes. Someone is going to get under our skin and we're going to snap, or we are going to waste time when we should have been praying a rosary, or we are probably at some point going to engage in gossip. Now, this doesn't mean that we should just give in to it, but we can't grow irritable with ourselves when we do sin. St. Francis says, quote, "One of the forms in which we should practice gentleness regards ourselves, in never growing irritable with ourselves in our imperfections. For although, in reason, we must be vexed and angry with ourselves when we commit faults, yet we ought to guard against bitter, fretful displeasure or spiteful anger with ourselves." Unquote. My dad knew that if he was constantly vexed or angry with himself, if he ate a cookie or didn't work out quite as hard as he should have, he knew he would grow bitter, and his love for bodybuilding would become a burden instead of something that he liked. And the spiritual life is like that too. If we are constantly beating ourselves up because, quote, we are displeased at finding ourselves not perfect, unquote, we will begin to loathe ourselves, and living out the Christian life will become burdensome and joyless. St. Francis gives the best advice at the end when he says, quote, "Therefore, when your heart has fallen, raise it gently, humbling yourself greatly before God and acknowledging your faults, but without marveling at your fall. But nevertheless, heavily detest the offense of which you have been guilty in God's sight, and with hearty courage and confidence in his mercy, begin once more to seek that virtue from which you have fallen away." Unquote. That's great advice from St. Francis, and we should definitely all take that to heart. So that is all for today, Catholic Pilgrims. I'll see you back here soon, and until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.